little known fact. Yeah, years ago, I cut my teeth as a writer in the film business, so, but I was always behind the scenes. But anyway, I want to mention that there are people from all over the country, and as well as people who are from Yonkers. So the first thing I want to do is clarify that Yonkers is not the Bronx. And I had someone who I was interviewing about 2 weeks ago. He said that he looked me up before I interviewed him, and he said, "So you're from the Bronx?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And he insisted because he'd read that I was from Yonkers, so he made that assumption. So one of the things that I am working on as a writer is to really differentiate and show and give Yonkers its own place in the sun where it rightfully deserves. So just a little background on why Yonkers is not the Bronx. And this is the dry part of my talk. In the early 20th century, some politicians wanted to make Yonkers the 6th borough of New York City, but that initiative failed. And today, the population of Yonkers fluctuates between being the 3rd and 4th largest city in New York State. And right now it's 3rd. I think it eclipsed Rochester. And despite Yonkers has its own prominence in the world, the city, it's often been dismissed as a working class town on the Hudson River with a funny sounding name. And my Yonkers trilogy captures the historical reality of Yonkers, what it used to be like. The city was once a melting pot teeming with immigrants who came to the city in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And the early working class did not have to leave Yonkers to find work. I mean, they could if they wanted to, but there were plenty of jobs available in one of the city's great factories. Otis Elevator, Alexander and Sons, Alexander Smith and Sons, Carpet Factory. I think it employed up to 70,000 people at one point. The Domino Sugar Refinery called by locals called the Sugar House. And back then, Yonkers reigned as the queen of manufacturing. So where we get into with the Yonkers trilogy, really we're the children or grandchildren of the early immigrants. And I came from a family of immigrants going back 3 generations. My grandmother, Lily Vaccarino, worked at the carpet factory, and her husband raised pigeons on his back stoop on English Street. And my Irish grandfather was an iceman, and later he became a night watchman at a Catholic orphanage. The city's complex ethnic diversity made me accepting of the full range of humanity. As a little kid, my first teacher, my kindergarten teacher, was Black, and my closest friends were Polish, Korean, Jewish, Irish, and Italian. And in my estimation, Yonkers really is not a suburb. The city blurs the distinction amongst urban, suburban, and rural. It's all of that. Southwest Yonkers is as gritty as it gets. And I remember as a kid with the ease of moving from urban areas like Nodine Hill, where all my cousins lived, to very pastoral areas like Untermeyer Park. And of all the things, scent is what I remember the most. Yonkers had a fragrance, sort of a Yonkers perfume. It was a combination of carbon monoxide and the greenery from so many trees, and soft pretzels sold by sidewalk vendors in Getty Square. And down by the railroad tracks, you could pick up the scent from the Hudson River, and the air was swollen with the scent of dead fish, raw sewage, waterlogged grass, mud, tar. Had a hint of salt in the air too, because the water could be brackish depending on where you stood and the way the currents ran on a given day. My neighborhood was full of kids. We hung out on the street. We played outdoors in all kinds of weather. And as soon as a group of kids formed, we launched into a game: basketball, football, street hockey, Red Rover, tag, hide and go seek, hops, you name it. I remember walking and riding my bike everywhere. As a little kid, I took the bus and I transferred to bus lines all over the city. By the time I was 13, I grew more bold, and I found my way to the subway line, and that opened up the gates to New York City. I was scared to take the subway alone, but I didn't show fear. I knew how to act tough and take a don't mess with me stance. Yonkers kids were tough. We knew how to take care of ourselves. So despite the city's age spanning back to the colonial era and even to the Revolutionary War and its rich cultural heritage and diversity, surprisingly, few books, fiction or nonfiction, are set in Yonkers. Among the heavyweight celebrity writers, Neil Simon wrote Lost in Yonkers, but it was a play, and he wasn't from there. In fact, he'd grown up in the Bronx. And remember, Yonkers is not the Bronx. Beat poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti was born in Yonkers, but that fact is frequently missing from his biography. And Don DeLillo lived in Yonkers for many years, but he never wrote about it. With its long history, there is no reasonable explanation as to why so few books are about Yonkers. It does seem that the literary world has ignored this city as much as they have ignored the working class. Why there are so few books that depict working class characters is something that I plan to talk about today. Since the time I was a kid, I wrote a number of stories, mentioned earlier, that later became the foundation for the first book, Yonkers Yonkers. And after that, it never occurred to me to write another one. I was done. In fact, I'd already started to work on a different project. But the characters would not leave me alone. They kept squawking in that, the Yonkers accent. And you know what I mean by that, right? Walk and talk and coffee, roof. And they kept me up all night. So I had no choice. I had to shut them up. So I wrote the second book, The Heart of Yonkers. Now it's the third book that really took me by surprise. I was in New York City in April 2019. The Metropolitan Museum of New York, the Met, had a limited exhibition of works by Clifford Still. And the great abstract expressionist artist, Clifford Still, didn't give his paintings titles. He wanted people to find their own meaning without relying on his title as a guide. So one painting identified as PH 372 struck me with the intensity of a thunderclap. I'd show that painting to you, but if I put up a little picture here, it just wouldn't do justice to the massive scale and the power of that image. So I sat on that bench that day and I stared at the painting for nearly an hour, and I said to myself, this is my next book. And so it is. After I saw Clifford Still's work at the Met, I knew the third Yonkers book would be dark, very dark. My protagonist, Cookie Colangelo, would take a metaphorical journey similar to Joseph Conrad's Charles Marlowe in Heart of Darkness. My interpretation of Clifford Still's painting is what led to the development of the cloud imagery in So Not Yonkers, of the extraordinary movement and convergence of dark clouds traveling across a western sky. After Cookie Colangelo, my protagonist, sees the representation of the painting, she understands what she has been living through. She calls that her clouds of meaning. I own the clouds, and the clouds own me, she says. Her life has changed, but not for the better. The two friends she had been long held close to her heart had drifted away like clouds racing in an unsettled sky. There are as many ways to describe cloud imagery, as I found out, as there are ways to understand this confused and troubled young woman who is desperately trying to find her way in the world. She wishes she could read the meaning in clouds, to say the way, as if she were reading the meaning in tea leaves, or if she could read clouds the same way mystics can read tarot cards. She manages to see clouds everywhere, except in the sky. I'm grateful that I had a chance to write about the great artist Clyfford Still. His art is powerful and transforms people. It transformed me, and it transformed my character. I think we forget just how powerful artists can be and the impact they can have on us. I made 2 trips to the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver, where I learned of Still's birth in the tiny town of Grandin, North Dakota, and also of his childhood spent in Spokane, Washington, which isn't that far from where I live in Seattle. So prior to becoming a pioneer as an abstract expressionist, Clyfford Still had painted farm workers, mostly in Alberta, Canada. His early work captured the reality of the Depression-era working class. I am interested in many things related to the working class. I guess you could figure that out pretty easily. I grew up working class, and I'm proud of it. I learned from an early age that I would have to work hard to achieve things that might come more easily to people who are given easier access to the American dream. We might have gone to college, but we took out student loans, or we got scholarships, or we worked 2 or 3 jobs while we were putting ourselves through school. As kids, our homes were modest. Some of us never owned a home. I remember the art that hung on our walls. We weren't collecting, paintings like Clyfford, created by artists like Clyfford Still, but hung on the wall. We had framed family photos and religious prints. Most did not have easy access to art. We gained exposure to art by using the Carnegie Library in Getty Square that had those incredible lunettes up in the children's room, and the annual field trips that took us to museums in the city. The Yonkers trilogy covers 5 years in the life of Cookie Colangelo and her family and friends. And when I think about it, it took 5 years to write the trilogy in between other writing projects and other books. In those 5 years, from 1969 to 1973, a cultural renaissance was happening, especially among young people. The civil rights movement, Black rights, gay rights, women's rights. There was a concerted effort and a solid coalition among young people to make a society that was more fair, more just, and more humane. There was a genuine desire to cast aside the old traditional ways of doing things that had caused social injustice in the first place. So Not Yonkers, the 3rd book, takes place in 1973. The issues prevalent then are the same issues that we grapple with today: racism, sexual harassment, abortion, homophobia, mental illness, organized crime, economic inequality, violence, death, lost love, and lost friendship. The inclusion of so many controversial issues weren't randomly thrown into the story. It's not how it works. It's what happened to the characters. Their lives are their characters. These issues are born from the Yonkers of the past. That is the Yonkers that I remember. Now, that doesn't mean that the events that happened to Cookie Colangelo happened to me. I wrote fiction. And yet, Cookie is based on me and a lot of girls like me. I knew them. I grew up with them. The literary world, agents, publishers, and pundits do not understand the working class. When I first showed the manuscript to agents and publishers, I was told repeatedly that the character Cookie Colangelo was far too young for the story, but I ignored them. Yes, Yonkers girls did grow up far too fast. After the first book came out, a dozen women came up to me and told me, "That's me. You wrote about me." There were a lot of girls in Yonkers who came from hardscrabble circumstances, who were tough on the outside, but heroic in some ways too. I've had some women who did not grow up in Yonkers. They grew up in Chicago or Portland, Washington, D.C. They said the same thing, that I had written their story. Maybe it's because Yonkers really is a microcosm of America. And maybe, just maybe, there are a lot of cookies out there. Today, very few books depict working class characters. The latest roundup extracted from Goodreads shows a decline in urban working class literature. There is, however, an abundance of genre romances, floating serial themes such as hard hats and love, or blue-collar handymen. These types of books might be entertaining, but they do not inspire critical thinking. They do not engender a sense of compassion. We do not learn to care for people who are unlike ourselves. Books written by working class authors like Frank McCourt, William Kennedy, Pat Barker, or Raymond Carver continue to stand the test of time, but they were published long ago, and it can be speculated, would these authors get published today? It's not only the literary world that does not understand the working class, the media is far worse. They do not treat the working class with respect. I've been studying, working on another project, and I can cite to numerous instances to support what I'm saying, but I'm going to table that. If you want to ask that later on, that's fine. But I can strongly state the mainstream media needs to earn the trust of the working class. Journalists ought to start by asking, who is the working class? Working class adults are stereotypically defined as those lacking a college degree. Yet in today's economy, a UPS driver, a delivery person, or an Uber driver, or a barista at Starbucks, who all have college degrees, would still be defined as working class. A 2022 Gallup poll found that 46% of American adults identified as working or lower. That's almost half the country of workers, with the rest identifying as upper middle, or middle. The book industry and the media has lost touch with the working class who want to read about people they can relate to, or about people they can realistically aspire to become. There is a disconnect between the reality of people who have grown up working class and those who have not. Through the power of storytelling, I aim to bridge that gap. I want people to understand the nuances of Yonkers culture in the same way Edna O'Brien depicted Ireland in the early 1960s, and Willa Cather conjured the Great Plains in the mid-19th century. The Yonkers trilogy established a time and place in New York history that will never come again. I'm inspired by the fact that I grew up in a working class culture. I will always view myself as a working class kid from Yonkers, and that means I will never, ever, ever forget where I came from. I think it's time to give Yonkers a fair shake in the book world. Yonkers deserves its own place in the sun. My books have been inspired from my observation of the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of working class heroes. Their stories need to be told, and their voices need to be heard. So that's all I have to say for now, and I welcome questions about anything that I mentioned here, or anything else that you thought about relative to any of those three books. So thank you, and thank you for being here, and thanks, Mike.
Can you talk more about the media and their opinion of the working class
Yeah,
and how they, yeah.
there were three recent examples. They're not CNN, for example, the town hall that they held, it was in the middle of May, I believe May 14th. They had an audience that was very vocal about cheering on Trump whenever he was slanderous or saying nasty things about people. And for those of us who've worked in the media, it's very important to remember that any television production, anything, when there's a live audience, that audience is very carefully vetted. So they intentionally selected people who would be obnoxious and look dumb and raucous, and an example of the dumb working class.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example.
Hey, Patricia, this is Arnie.
Hi.
Hi, good to see
Hi.
you.
Good
You
to
left a
see you.
lump, hearing you talk left a lump in my throat, to be honest. Um, Carrying on with that thought about the working class, we tend to kind of define it in terms of economics, but there's some value systems that go on with the working class, I think, that really define it more so than, say, an economic class. I mean, I came from a working class, actually a rural farmers class, really. And so,
Which is working class, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so there's values and virtues and things like that that we carry on. We don't necessarily look at it from an economic standpoint as
Yeah.
much as we carry on, and some of the other attributes and things.
Well, value is a part of it, and ethics are part of it, and but I think economics is a driving factor. It's the most important part, and if you look at the fleeing of the manufacturing industry, going offshore, and the changes that have been made in the country that make it much more difficult for people to have the same level of social mobility that they had in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I recently wrote a discussion guide. It's called Yonkers Beats, that will go out to accompany these books. And it'll cost like nothing, to get it. But it has a bibliography in there of suggested readings that go into a lot of the impacts made on the working class in the last 30 years, and to maybe project some trends for the future.
Hey, it's Claire. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Oh my gosh.
Claire Scully. Yay. Yeah.
What two Scullys on the screen today. Patty, I really enjoyed the books. I got to tell you though, I had a lot of sleepless nights having retread those steps again. I'm happy to have lived through them, yeah. And the other side. And thanks so much for your talk and for your concern and your affection for our beloved city and neighborhood. But I have a question. You did a lot of really good research, and I'm not sure if you're actually drawing from your own journals. The
yeah.
details about Louise and some of the places in Getty Square were pretty, yeah. like Madame Zelda over in Greens or Grants and the Maple French fries. Sorry you didn't mention the egg creams there. They were always good. Yes. But it's so tight and so accurate. And I know you picked fiction, your genre. What had you ever thought of using historical fiction as an application because you did so much research?
That's important. I mean, Claire, thank you for bringing that up, because even though it's fiction, it's really important to get your facts straight. Where Greens was located, where Grants was located. These are the two major department stores we had in the center of the city. And if you don't get those facts straight, it tends to undermine the credibility of the story, even though it's fiction, because people have a recollection. In fact, I think when I write that way, I always feel that the reader is drawing in their own memories of those places. If they're inaccurate, then they're going to say, oh, there's something wrong there. It doesn't resonate. It's not what I remember.
But Patricia, oh, go ahead.
Yep, true to that. So I hope if there's a fourth, no. Keep that. I really thank you, Patty.
No. Yeah. No, the next book I'm working on is about the great musical talent that came out of Yonkers, but it's nonfiction. It's all factual, but we've had some incredible people, musicians, and one of them is actually present here tonight. And Joel Diamond. Joel is phenomenal. He's a prodigy. He started playing the organ at 3 years old, and by the time he was, a tween, he was playing professionally. He is a composer. He's composed ballets, composed symphonies. He went on tour for years with the Mick Taylor, the Rolling Stones. I mean, his background, is exemplary, is in terms of somebody who grew up working class and just rose by sheer talent, sheer talent and tenacity.
A
So
lot of work, a lot of blood and sweat.
yeah. So, and there were a lot of great musical people, that need to be recognized. It's not just Steven Tyler and Aerosmith. There were many others.
Hi, Patricia. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Susan Bond here.
Oh my God.
Thank
Hi.
you so much for the
Very good.
invite. This
Yeah.
was so
Yeah.
informative. You really
nice to
tugged on
see
my
you.
heartstrings when you were kind of recanting and recounting different experiences from Yonkers, and having the surname Colangelo and having had gone to school with you. I sadly have not read your books, but I am going to definitely now that I hear all the information. And I never realized that so little had been written of Yonkers. And it's very sad, it really is, because it's very rich in history and experience. And we just have so much that we had gone through in
Yeah.
terms of growing up in the era we did also. So I just want to thank you, and I'm rushing off to the bookstore, and I'm going to get my hands on those little guys.
Well, I have to tell you, I love your last name.
Thank
How
you.
you come up with last names? Well, in this case, it was alliteration, Cookie Colangelo, like her name was Conchetta. But that I always make a list of surnames depending on what I'm writing about. And I have a naming dictionary, and I do research. And some of the names in the Yonkers books, with the exception of Colangelo, they were named after raptors because there was a strong owl motif. So like DeFalco or Bertha Sokol, they were so falcons, or so there was all that going on. That's just really a subtle little.
And Colangelo means with the angels. So
We
That's
actually,
interesting.
we actually have a mutual friend who just passed away, Pat Colangelo.
my sister.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I remember Patty. Yeah.
Yeah, Patty and I went to school together.
Yeah.
It's strange how 6 degrees of separation. It
Yes.
definitely, and the older you get, the smaller your world gets. And there's a lot of relationships there.
Yeah. Yeah. We're all tethered together to some extent.
Mhm.
Patty, I have a question about Cookie, the character. Do you think she learned anything from this adventure, or any regrets, any kind is seeking redemption at all?
That wouldn't be another book. So don't. At this point, at this juncture, I think that as she grew older, her life grew worse. And that was something that I really stressed. That was kind of a working class issue, that when you're 13, you think you can take on the world, but all of a sudden you start approaching adulthood.
Mhm.
You have to earn a living. Are you going to go to college? How are you going to do it? How are you going to accomplish it? Who's going to pay for it? Who are you going to be? I mean, all those things start bearing down, and you realize that it's really a struggle to achieve, the quote unquote American dream. It's even more difficult today than it used to be.
Yeah, well, as someone who teaches university students, I feel really bad that the debt that they're taking on, that we didn't have to worry about such things.
Yeah.
To that extent,
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question. Patricia, do you see this trilogy as a book as a set for young adults, or for adults, or for both?
Both. It's a crossover. And you look at some of the classic books, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, or that they're written for both audiences, and that they should find meaning. Well, there's a beautiful passage that I saw. It wasn't, it was in the Song of the Lark, quoted by Willa Cather. She was quoting Wagner, saying that in art, we try to recapture our youth. That's always the push, to go back to our youth and recapture not that we idolize it or fantasize about it, but that there was something at that point in our lives, everything was in front of us and we're not jaded necessarily and think that we can really accomplish things. It's only through the struggles that we have that we realize it's like pushing a rock up, you know, Sisyphus, and crushing, coming back down. And that this sometimes the struggle is overwhelming. I mean, who among us hasn't struggled and hit the wall? It's very difficult. So that's why I would say that this book is definitely a crossover, because young people, you know, they have that vision, or even if they lack the vision, they think the vision will come.
Hi, Patty, it's Barbara. I was looking for the hand raised thing and I couldn't find it. I apologize.
Another Scully.
Yes, another Scully.
And
Don't worry, we're not
you're
all
also
here.
in this book. Barbara Scully was a phenomenal singer, and I remember she had the most powerful pipes that I'd ever heard on any female vocalist in my life. And you and Jay Walker and Marilyn Kleinberg. So
And
I've
Joel.
interviewed you all, and Joel. Hello. So yeah.
Thank you.
Incredible.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I wasn't looking for that, but thanks for finding it. It was quite the neighborhood. Kickball comes to mind. And one of our neighbors always becoming quite cross because the kickball would inevitably go into poor woman's bushes. And I know my parents were not sympathetic to her plea. My dad wanted us to be able to do pretty much what we wanted in the street.
Yeah.
Thank you for the nod to the working class family. I'm very proud of having been a working class kid. I pride myself in being down to earth. I hope I was that way as a teacher, as a performer, as just a human on the earth, because it was a hard way to grow up, as your book suggests. And that's true. It was also an awful lot of fun. You know. So I'm going to read that third book. It's not going to keep me up, is it?
I hope not.
You said dark.
It
Well,
is dark.
lovely to see you, hear you.
It's not going to
And
be allowed in the libraries in Florida or Missouri or Texas. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, right.
Congratulations.
A banned book.
You
Yeah.
made it to the ban list.
We need t-shirts, Pat. Thank you.
Patty, I have a question that kind of, it actually piggybacks. I think it was Claire that brought it up about your research, but
Yeah.
I think beyond the research, because when I see you, I always mean to ask, or when we talk, I mean to ask you this question, and the detail in the research is obviously there, where Greens was or where Woolworths was. But what struck me is when I was reading some of what you would write, like, you know, as a 13-year-old, was she walking through the streets of Yonkers and making notes? Because that's how detailed, like, did you keep I mean, you struck things, and unfortunately I can't remember them right now.
Yeah.
But struck such a chord, things that would come into my mind that I haven't thought of in 50 years. But they were correct. I mean, you would identify something or name something, or bring up even an emotion from something that was going on at that time. I don't know if other people that have read it felt that way, but it was such incredible detail that I really thought that perhaps you spent your time as an adolescent, as a teenager, taking notes. And that's why the accuracy of everything is just right on. It's just right there.
think that the research phase was the most difficult part. And I
Mhm.
wrote a lot of poetry, a lot of bad poetry in those years,
Mhm.
but not journal entries. And if they, if I did
Wow.
write, they're gone. But
So that was all, a lot of it was from memory, that just what you.
memory and, for example, the street names, I had to order maps, historical maps from the city of Yonkers to get my photography.
Right,
precise.
right.
Because some of those streets have been eliminated. Like the
Mhm.
street where my grandfather lived,
Yeah.
Ingram Street is
I
gone.
just drove down Jackson the other day.
Mhm. Yeah.
I drove down Jackson Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then my grandmother's tenement there is gone. And so to reconstruct that, you can get historical maps that are, say, from 1970 and then later 1975, 1980.
Mhm,
So you can kind of build literally to build a map and to look at what was there. And then to look, some of the buildings, say in the second book, they were, forgive me for saying this, the midget bar, because midget is not acceptable, but that's what the name of the bar
That's
was.
what it was called.
Midget, that was what it was called. And that location is still there.
Mhm.
And in fact, we went there.
We went.
When I saw you. It was,
Yes.
we
Yep.
drove by on the corner of
Yep.
Oak and Elm
We got
Street.
out and yeah.
So it's but it's a Hispanic.
But to me, it was
dollar
beyond.
store.
It was even beyond that. It was
Yeah.
beyond the research of the streets or the locations, maybe. And I'd have to go back and look at the books again to really identify what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Whether, maybe the accuracy of a song that was that particular year, that and I know you could look that up and find that out by research, but it
Yeah.
was so far beyond that, and that's what I'm saying, beyond just research. It was facts that you would pull up that I would say, wow, it's back there in the back of my head, but
Yeah.
I had forgotten all about that.
It's
And
a little crazy because when I'm in that, my husband can attest, when I'm in that creative space where the characters are coming alive and they're,
Mhm.
it's a little bit like insanity, a little psychosis, because I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I hear dialogue, but that's marrying up with the contextual of what's fact and what's not. And if I'm looking at an area of the city that the character's responding to that, the character's
Mhm.
not me. It's
right.
what I'm hearing or seeing. So some makes it into the book and some is eliminated. And that's the great struggle in being a writer, is that a literary writer, if you're writing genre and you've got a precise plot point and very, stereotypical characters, that's one thing. You can make your characters do anything you want. But if you let your characters really become fully formed and take over, then they're going to do things that you don't want them to do. No, don't do that. And you have to rein them in, whether you're going to allow that to be acceptable or not. So I think it's the marrying together in that process. It's almost like an alchemy that you're looking at reality. And at the same time, the creative part, I don't even feel like it's me. It's not, my ego is not there. I'm just a receptacle. I'm like a vessel that it's pouring into me. And I think that people who are artists and people who are musicians and creative talent, that's how a work manifests itself, is that you're just an instrument for it. You're not thinking consciously, because if you thought consciously, again, you'd go back, and if you're a musician, you'd write jingles for television commercials, or as you'd be, crank out a mystery a month, like a formulaic book. Or as an artist, maybe be a graphic designer and just do what the advertising agency wants you to do. So there's that element of creativity, and then there's maybe something that could be more elevated to what art is.
It's a gift, though. I think it's a gift in you that you can. It's more than memory. It's it's more than memory and research. It's what you brought to each scene in the book.
One of the things that I have been struck with, being an interloper from Southwest Yonkers, not from Northwest Yonkers, is the universality of the experiences. I mean, I'll confess to being a few years older, but and I think I actually shared this one story with Patricia at one point. I was probably, well, old enough, an adult, reading Sid Caesar's autobiography. And it started out, I grew up in the factory town of Yonkers.
Mhm,
And I said to my brother, Yonkers isn't a factory town. And of course, by that time, there was no Alexander Smith and a few of the other factories that had bloomed and blossomed during World War II.
Yeah.
Were totally gone. But I mean, I was just shocked. And he said, well, your uncle worked for this one, your grandfather worked for this one. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean.
Right.
And, I truthfully was very shocked, even though, my friends' parents worked for the various factories. We never really thought of ourselves that way. Truly, we were all working class. Another story, which I also found interesting, when I started teaching, I was at school 12 for the few years before it closed. I happened to be dating a fellow whose father was a head of a school of education at one of the big schools in New York City. And he wanted to see where I was working. We drove by and I showed him the school and he literally said, I can't have that. Of course, I'm thinking, what the, is it your business where I'm teaching? And he said to me, don't worry, my father will get you into a decent school. We'll get you into Scarsdale. I looked at him and I said, my father grew up next door to that. What do you mean I shouldn't be teaching there?
Right.
People just didn't understand. Yonkers is Yonkers. I don't know if we're unique,
Yeah.
but our general experiential lifestyles were the same. I mean,
Yes.
we didn't hang around in the wooded areas of Northwest Yonkers. People I grew up with hung out in Van Cortlandt Park
Yeah.
with experiences very much the same. And as you said, Yonkers has an incredible history. We've got such richness of everything from wonderful to not so wonderful to difficult to criminal to not so criminal. And I love it. How could you
Yeah.
not love Yonkers? And why
Yeah.
would we want to be part of New York City, even though they tried so hard for so many years?
Yeah. Exactly.
I wanted to respond to Barbara, Patty, because both her and Claire had my commentary also about how meticulous you were. And the one thing that I remember, Barbara, is
Yeah.
the tower on the Palisades and the red light.
Right.
I think it was in Yonkers, but I'm not certain because
Yes.
there's a bunch of books there, but that just struck me. And I remembered moments in time seeing that. It was a
Yeah.
prominent
Well, it's funny.
fixture.
I can see it now from my bedroom window.
Yeah.
So in reading that in her book, that is absolutely one of those things that popped into my mind because I see it because I live here and I never left. She hasn't been, really been here in 50 years. So to remember that kind of detail is exactly what.
Yeah. And I got to see your brother Huey twice during our reunion, once with Tom McNally on a Friday, and Tom drove from Virginia to see us. But getting back to the book, growing up in Yonkers and looking at the working class side of who we are, it helped me in my career. I worked as an instructor at a private residential high school for students who were falling through the cracks at traditional high school settings. So we had kids from A to Z from all over the country. And by design, we had kids from all different backgrounds, races, religions, socioeconomic backgrounds. And, my gritty upbringing really helped me with all the kids, because I could relate, and they saw me too. And it was definitely an advantage growing up where I did, and in the time that I did, or we did.
Yeah.
No
Patty,
one mentioned Otis Elevators.
Mhm.
I
My
did.
grandfather worked for him.
It's one of the great factories. Yeah. But
Mhm.
with Alexander Smith and Sons Carpet Factory and the Sugar House. Those are the three big factories in town. And that's the thing, that people could live in Yonkers and work in Yonkers, and they didn't have to commute to New York City. They could. I mean, certainly many people did. They commuted to everywhere, you know, in the tri-state area, but there was plenty of jobs to be had there.
I have a friend in San Francisco whose father was the president of Otis Elevators.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
He wasn't working class, but
I don't take elevator. I try to walk unless I'm going a ton of stories, and I live in Colorado now, but every single time I get in an elevator,
You
I
look.
look down to see if it's a notice.
Yeah, me
I-
too.
Or on the
Me
buttons.
too.
Yeah.
I never get in an elevator without doing that.
Something funny, at one point in my career, I worked in one of the Otis elevator buildings that had been taken over by the Board of Ed. Asked me if it was an Otis elevator in the building. No. I can't believe this.
That's so funny.
Wow.
Apparently someone, after their desertion
Yeah.
of Yonkers, has switched. Changed the
Yeah.
elevator. I couldn't believe it.
Okay.
Don't ask me what type it was, but it was like, oh my God, why don't they have an Otis elevator?
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. I don't remember what year they moved from Yonkers, but I know it was a big issue in terms of trying to keep them in, because it was so vital to the economy. And Otis Elevator got a better deal by moving south and better tax breaks. And so the city lost that business. And
Yeah, and sold their property for more money than they would have if they hadn't gotten tax abatements from Yonkers. They really, you know, I thought they did us wrong. They really screwed us over.
Yeah.
Patty, one of the things that I thought was interesting was when you sent me the PDF of the book,
Yeah.
you know, 3-4 months ago. And then when I saw the cover, I said, yeah, that's how I visualized Cookie. I mean, so I was curious how you came up with the cover image. You mentioned before about the clouds.
Yeah.
But the person,
Yeah,
yeah.
that image is a stock photo and of the person, and the cloud imagery, however, was created by Josue Mora, who has worked with me for years. He's the one who designs our covers for our magazine that we're now in our 11th year. And Josue and I have worked together since 2012. And originally I hired him as an intern. He was one of 2 interns, and he comes up with some great things. You know, he did all the covers for the Yonkers books.
So, but when you were looking for the stock photo, did you just like put in search 16-year-old teenager or something
No,
like
I
that?
think it was defiant. Looking for
Okay,
defiant,
okay.
rebellion, you know, just that kind
Right,
of,
right. No, I mean, that look is just really captures, it speaks volumes. Yeah,
you know, like the don't mess with me stance.
right.
Is certain. And I don't know, Mary, I think you could speak to this better than I can.
Maybe. Otis
Whether-
closed in 1983, by the way. I just looked it up.
When I remember when I was growing up, that there was a real push to be tough, to act tough, regardless of your gender, you know, your background, your ethnicity, your, you know, race, that the Yonkers way was to show how tough you were. And I don't think it's that way anymore. And I remember I was looking at writing a historical fiction that goes back to the early 20th century. And the character goes to Yonkers, and looking at the people on the Lower East Side, they were really tough. In the Bowery, I mean, they were really poor and they were really tough. And the way they spoke almost sounds like early Yonkers slang. So it occurred to me that maybe that's where it comes from. It's part of the immigrant culture, and that might have watered down by now. Now that kids who are growing up in Yonkers today don't feel that they have to be tough. I don't know.
I think I think
Some
the kids
question.
are taught to accept each other. You
Yeah,
know, it would be part of what some people would refer to as the woke ideology.
Yeah,
Because, and we do, you know, in the classroom, that was one of the things that we really the kids to do, to accept each other, to be kind to each other. And actually, you know, one of the things I laughed at when you were talking about the Yonkers accent, I had, I guess, what would be considered a Yonkers accent. The nuns at St. Denis assumed that I spoke that way because my mother was from upstate New York. I mean, I would say things like water.
what a. I still
Well,
slip
good.
into.
And, you know, the nuns would say to me, because my father's parents were immigrants, and he actually had a very polished style of speech, very universal. And, you know, he would be the one who would be called on to make announcements at over PAs and all of that. And truthfully, I never heard a bit of it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that was just how we spoke. But I mean, I
When
really
I,
think
yeah.
said that.
When I first moved to the West Coast, I was 21 and I was going into law and I was working as a paralegal. And my boss said to me, if you don't lose that accent, he says, judges are going to rule against your mouth. That was a wake up. I thought everyone,
That's very
I mean, I didn't realize, you know, how that it was really so strong, but it was. And yeah, it's hard to kick. I don't think you ever really, you know, unless you train, you know, but.
My mouth is hanging open. Yeah, when I went to college upstate, people who grew up upstate or from other areas of the country didn't think I had a New York accent. So apparently Yonkers.
yeah, I've heard that too.
Universal.
Mhm.
We weren't that far out of the norm, except for the nuns at St. Denis.
And if you travel to Long Island, Yonkers is considered upstate.
Yes.
New York
Yeah,
City
that's
thinks we're
true.
upstate, even though.
Yeah.
I have to interject, I think an era that had a lot to do with what you talk about with what's going on in Yonkers now. In the late 1980s, we had the DSEG case from the NAACP taken in Yonkers, and it was very contentious. But having taught in Yonkers and having lived with that aspect of desegregating the kids,
Yeah.
that had a lot to do with the acceptance of difference. And when I just retired from teaching in Yonkers, I ended up back there. I looked over the makeup of the classroom, and we had kids from Middle East, Africa. We had diplomats' kids in Yonkers public schools. We had a big Irish immigration movement, and a big special education component in every school. And they used a magnet program to shuffle the enrollments up. So they had a school that was arts, and then sports, and then science and math, which was the one I was in. And it did a lot to shuffle up the enrollment. Now they're trying to go back to neighborhood schools, call it, because the funds, the tax funds, school funds were not evenly distributed among the kids from the West and the kids from the East. So, you know, it's swinging back, the pendulum's swinging back to the right. We went pretty far left, and then it's coming back to the right again. So we'll see what ends up. But I think that had a lot to do with it.
It was interesting that you said that at the time of the that they shuffled up the schools, 1986. I went from school 6 all the way up the street to Martin Luther King, which is the school for high technology and computer science. And our classes, and of course, I don't know what racial composition was before, but our classes were very mixed. But everybody that was at King was from the west side of town.
Yeah.
You know,
It became a balloting thing, and the schools that got the last of the ballots were the ones that were located in tough neighborhoods. You know, there were 4 neighborhoods, so that's how it didn't function well. That was a weakness of it.
yeah, and I actually was teaching the holding pen for pearls, and the parents were absolutely thrilled with the school and with the program. The kids got a tremendous education there. I
Yeah.
would say 90% of my kids within a year or two ended up in pearls. But the parents were very, very happy. When I was at 6, the parents were very concerned about their kids being bused. You know,
Yeah.
as several parents said, if my child is sick, I have to take the bus to go get him and then bring him back home on the bus. I don't want to do that. It was a wrenching situation for everyone.
It's,
I think we
the,
also overdid the magnet schools.
yeah, the discussion guide that, again, and, it's only about 60 pages, but it has a bibliography in there, and there are, it does probe into racism, and it does probe into poverty, it does probe into homophobia, and very complicated issues. There's one book that I highly recommend that's called Poverty by America, and it's by the same author. Gosh, I have it right here, excuse me. It's Matthew Desmond, who won a Pulitzer for Evicted, but there's a section in the book, and it's corroborated by other readings. It's just about that whole desegregation and busing and the impacts on, and really on racism. And it's something that's worth exploring and really drilling down and examining why it impacted the working class more than impacted, say, the elitists, what I call the professional managerial elite. And so it's a very complicated issue. And I think you could just take up and spend hours dissecting it. And the other book that I recommend is not popular, even among liberals. It's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And it's extreme, basically we're white, we're racist. But it's, and a lot of people object to that, but it really is looking at systemic racism and the origins of that and how that's reinforced by the healthcare system, education system, on and on and on. And I know people who are just, when they look at that book, they say, oh, it's just going too far, but it's a good guidepost, a good place to start a dialogue and to examine and ask yourself that question, to really be honest about it.
Not to make this about the Yonkers Public Schools, Pat, and we do digress a little bit, but somebody mentioned the West Side, staying on the West Side, and it's really logistical. There are many parents on the West Side, especially the more crowded pockets of Yonkers, have to take public transportation, and it's less than half the time for them to travel from southwest to northwest. But that's kind of neither here nor there. But it's go ahead.
The area where my grandmother lived, down on Jackson Street, that area was redlined. And I didn't know that until later on in my life, that she basically abandoned her property because it was considered worthless. So why that happened is, something to really drill down and think about, because if areas are redlined, then what kind of schools are they going to have in their home neighborhoods? Right. That's why this is just a huge, huge topic. And I think that there's room in there to have open dialogues, discussion groups, book groups, and to examine it.
And to point up the positive side of the changes that have gone on. You can say what you will about white flight, about the existence of the charter school. I like Claire mentioned, and this woman who just spoke now, I left Yonkers at 19 because of racism. And I hated that about their town that I was from, feeling that experience. I left for 20 years. I came back to teach at School 16. And as the other ladies have said, things have changed, and it's wonderful, because now our boys and girls, our teens are, it's no longer mom and dad need our boyfriend or girlfriend to be Jewish or to be white or to be anything really. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to see the multiculturalism that's come to be.
It was always that way. I remember I went
Yeah.
to school
Yeah.
16 for 2 years, the third and fourth grade. And my class size was about 20 kids. And I was on waitlisted to get into Christ the King. Went to Christ the King, class size was 51.
Yeah, yeah.
And you just
Holy
got,
Rosary.
I remember, you just got whacked around, if you didn't behave, but they were so far advanced even then. And then the ethnic composition was so amazing, compared to, and then what they offered, all kinds of services and music programs and special tutoring and, just phenomenal.
Wonderful.
And the schools don't get
Patricia,
the credit they should.
Patricia, I'm sorry, Patricia, this already, I have a
Hi.
prior engagement, so I'm gonna have to cut out. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for putting this together. It was
Yeah.
awesome. So
Thank you,
hope to see you,
Marty.
hope
I
to
hope
see
to
you
see
soon
you-
over some coffee.
Yeah. Take care.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I can't see his name. I think he lives in Seattle.
Okay.
He's from Minnesota originally.
Sorry, I meant to
Marty.
mute.
Marty Alger. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. So
Thank you, Patricia. This is Chris.
hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Very well. And my when I saw Friendlies and Caravel ice cream, we had that on upstate New York too. I mean, real upstate, like
Yeah.
Syracuse area. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a lovely book. I've enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Chris, we danced together.
We do.
Yeah.
And we have a good time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
If there's a correlation between ballet and dance, or ballet and writing, it's ballet training is probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. And the constant push to improve where you are, your stance, your form, your positioning, your performance, it's totally non-writing. I mean, in terms of its physicality, but the discipline is so strong that for me, it complements writing. And I think it complements people who are musicians and artists because of I've seen some, I have a former client, Barbie Leifert, who's an artist, but she was a dancer through most of her life. And then a lot of her work, you can see the impact of movement. So that's one thing that I try to do as frequently as I can. When I'm not writing or reading, I take a dance class.
Keep moving.
Yeah. So regardless of, those things that beset us as we get older. Yeah.